Today I'll be talking about Darwinism and evolution. And they're not the same thing. Darwinism is what Darwin produced in terms of evolutionary theory. Evolution today is not quite what Darwinism was. And Darwin was not the first evolution man. So let's start first with the backdrop of when Darwin came about and what sort of mysteries or questions people were asking at that time. For example, the first one are the fossils. By that time, there were quite a lot of fossils discovered by European geologists, paleontologists, and there are various explanations that were given to them. Some people called them jokes of nature, Satan's false signs to lure us from faith, God's test of our faith, or remains of mythical dragons and serpents, and some religious views saying that these were just monsters that were turned into stone by some supernatural power, by some saint, and so on. And there was obviously the explanation that they were simply representing extinct creatures that existed before on Earth, and then somehow they became turned into stone, or they were embedded into stone of some sort. Other mysteries are the questions related to why we have so much variation, why so many different species on Earth. And remember, by that time, they haven't yet discovered anything compared with what we know today. But still, they were amazed by so many species and the fact that there was so much variation within any particular species, any particular kind. Other mysteries are related to whether species remain the same as they were created, or do they change? Now, there are various examples of records of creatures changing through the fossil record, for example, and various other evidences. So there comes Charles Darwin, who was born in 1809, and he came into a world full of questions of the sort. Now, he was born to a well-off middle-class family. His father was a doctor, and so he wanted him to be a doctor as well, because his grandfather was. And so he joined medical school at Edinburgh, and then he didn't last very long there. And then he transferred to Cambridge to study theology, and that's quite ironic that Darwin would have been, in that case, a minister in the Church of England. On the whole, he wasn't such a focused student. He was mediocre. He was interested in various things, including hunting, geology, and botany, and natural history, and so on. And obviously, to the dismay of his father, who wrote to him that you care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. Now, this was the situation until he got this lifetime opportunity in 1831 to join Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, on a voyage that will circumvent the globe. And he joined it as the ship's naturalist. And as a ship's naturalist, he was required to record various things, including biological specimens and geological observations, and so on. So, obviously, the first shock he got when he reached Brazil, the tropical forest, where he was able to see a variety of animals and plants, and he collected quite a good collection from there. Obviously, he was impressed with the huge diversity that you find in these locations. He was impressed with the Indians at the tip of South America in Tierra del Fuego, and he was impressed by their ability to survive under such very harsh and hostile environment, very cold, almost naked in the cold. He observed for himself firsthand an earthquake that changed the level of the land something like 2 meters, which was a dramatic thing that you rarely see for yourself. And obviously one of his remarkable experiences were actually in the Galapagos archipelago. These islands were actually volcanic islands. They were uninhabited, but they were uninhabited by humans, but they were inhabited by a variety of creatures that there was nothing like them anywhere else. Some of them might actually show relationship to some continental species, but a lot of them were not were quite different, or they have undergone changes while they're on the island, and it actually drove him to make some theories while he was there. And in his diary of his trip, of his voyage, he wrote, "I felt myself brought within reach of that fact, that mystery of mysteries." What he was referring to was the origin of life on Earth, because he was talking about the origin of life on these islands. How could they come there? How could they change while they were there? Why they were different from one island to the other? Why the same species might actually diverge into all sorts of species? Now, he was actually a meticulous observer. He wrote things, he took notes. In this picture there, in this figure there, he's depicted as trying to estimate the speed of a male tortoise chasing a female, which was something quite interesting. Anyway, now people still do it today, by the way, not Darwin at the time. Anyway, after he came back to England, he spent some time looking at his collections. He published a number of books. There was no mention of evolution there. And he was actually refraining from making his views public, only to a close circle of friends, until in 1858 he got a letter from a guy called Alfred Russel Wallace, who was not really so well off. He actually worked in the Far East, collecting specimens and selling them to museums. Now, he wrote to Darwin asking his opinion or his remarks on a paper that he was trying to publish about evolution by natural selection. And then Darwin and his friends realized that there's somebody who's actually producing a theory similar to Darwin's. And so they rushed him into eventually publishing his work. Now, in 1858, there was a joint presentation that Wallace was not aware of. And so they presented two papers there about evolution by natural selection. And I will come to explain this later on. Now, there wasn't much response in the meeting. And in 1859, he was eventually forced to publish his monograph there, the book, Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, this was actually a bestseller. And it was sold in one day. He was quite scared that nobody's going to buy this, and so he's trying to subsidize the publication. Now, in this book, he never mentioned the word evolution, and he used the word descent with modification, because he felt that this phrase, descent with modification, explained what his theory about, which is really that descendants inherit some characteristics from their ancestors, and from generation to generation you get differences in the traits and their frequency, and so he referred to this as being descent with modification. Now, what Darwin produced wasn't really original in the sense that evolution was there before, so there were a particular one there which is actually Darwin's idea, which is the mechanism of evolution, which is by natural selection. But before Darwin, there was a lot of talk about species not being constant. There was talk also about the changes occurring in the species being gradual, very slow over time. And there was also the notion of branching of species. That means we could actually relate them by trees, family trees, and you can actually sort of map their evolution in that way. So talking about the non-constancy of species, that's something that as old as the Greek philosophers. So Anaximander, and later the Roman philosopher Lucretius, talked about all living things being related, which is the relationship there is not something that people accept at that time, because that means descent, and that they had changed over time. So that was an old idea. But more recently, before Darwin, Lamarck also produced an idea there. Produced an idea about mechanism of evolution. which we call the transmutation of species. Now, the other postulate there, which is gradualism, which is a very important postulate there, because that actually requires a lot of time. There's slow change over time that previous theories had to explain how so many different groups of organisms appeared in the fossils and then disappeared and then appeared, other ones appeared and so on. So Buffon and Cuvier suggested that what was happening on Earth every now and then was a catastrophe. And each catastrophe would wipe out more or less the whole existence of living things, and then you have a new phase where you have other organisms appearing and then radiating and flourishing, and then another catastrophe and so on. Now, this idea was called catastrophism, and it suggests that there are extinctions they're happening, but they're happening due to catastrophes. And so to explain the so many different groups of organisms that were appearing in the fossils, and there was so many eras of organisms, they suggested that maybe the Earth must have been quite old, something like 70,000 years old, which is, for them, was very old. Now, creationists suggested in response to this that maybe the present creation is just the latest one, but before that there were 50 to 100 creations, divine creations that occurred on Earth. Now, Darwin's ideas there and others before him actually refuted this catastrophism. Instead, they adopted an idea from geology. Now, Hutton in the 18th century produced this idea, but not many people were able to understand it because he wrote in a very weird way that was quite cryptic, you know. And so Lyell in the 19th century, who was a contemporary of Darwin, and Darwin had his book, The Principles of Geology, on his voyage in the Beagle. And the idea is uniformitarianism, which simply says that in order to explain what was happening in the past, you don't have to really search there in the past. All you have to do is just observe what forces we can see today. So, for example, the same forces that we see today were happening in those days. And they're happening quite often as they're happening today, and maybe as powerful as they have been happening today. And so, for example, if you look at some or any sort of rock formation, the rock formation didn't just appear like this. It was actually the product of a process that we can observe today. For example, erosion and deposition. If you look at any river, you'll find that the river deposits sediments annually, every year, every day. There's new sediments that accumulate. And these sediments could be sometimes in the scale of centimeters, sometimes could be in the scale of more than this, sometimes could be the scale of less than centimeters. Now, if you take, for example, windstorms, sandstorms also move sand around, move sediments around by the wind, the force of wind. And then all of these together might eventually produce these geological formations. But they cannot just produce these formations just like that, or within a couple of thousand years or 100 years or whatever. Actually, in order for this process to eventually lead to the formation of these rocks, you need millions of years. So uniformitarianism suggests first that the processes are not really anything exotic or weird or supernatural or anything of the sort. They're just simple processes that we see today everywhere. And the other thing is that the process requires a long time. So that actually implies gradualism. And gradualism is the thing that people adopted in trying to explain the evolution of living things. Now, uniformitarianism could be explained in formations that we observe here and there, like, for example, grottos like the Joeta, for example. Now, these forms there did not just appear like this. They were not, in a way, created like this. They actually formed drop by drop. And you can go there and observe these drops happening. But if you look at these drops after a few thousand years, you will see that they actually formed these forms, the ones on top and the ones at the bottom. So this is what is implied by uniformitarianism. There's nothing dramatic about these formations. They're just simple processes, physical processes that are happening all the time. So the implication there, like I said, there's a gradual process, and also the other implication that the Earth must be very, very old. That's what the geologists came up with. And so the first one who was unfortunately remembered for the wrong things he postulated. But he's not remembered often for the fact that he was the first one to adopt this concept of uniformitarianism, was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Now, he made the first attempt at explaining biological evolution, and he called the transmutation of species. Now, he adopted uniformitarianism to explain how the evolution of organisms happens also in very tiny steps, very small steps, over a long period of time. Gradualism is the concept that he adopted. Now, the notion of branching is another thing that comes from Darwinism, and that's really at odds with what Aristotle suggested as a way of classifying organisms from the least perfect into the most perfect. Now, in Christian theology later, they adopted this as ladder of nature, or the great chain of being. And for them, the idea was to go from the most perfect amongst organisms are humans, but you can go beyond humans and talk about even more perfect organisms like angels, archangels, and eventually God at the top of this chain of being. Now, Darwinism did away with this, and the idea there was that organisms could be, all of them are at the same level, not at different levels. They're all at the same level of evolution in the sense that they all exist today. So they must have gone through the same period of evolution, and then we could also relate them in a way that shows the various groups, and then within each group you can find even more relationships and so on. Now, an important concept there that Darwin suggested, and he wrote, saying that, you know, before Darwin, people used to classify organisms according to similarity. Linnaeus did this, and we owe Linnaeus a lot of these classification systems, but there was no mention, there was just mention of similarity. But Darwin suggested that if they're going to be similar, that means they are related. The only cause of similarity in individuals is relationship. It's like the only cause of similarity between you and your brothers and sisters is because you come from the same parents. And we all come from some common ancestor, and so we all look similar because we are related. And so organisms that are similar, according to Darwin, were related. Now, the mechanism that Darwin suggested was natural selection. And natural selection was influenced by a couple of things that were happening at that time. For example, he read Thomas Malthus, who was an economist. And Malthus suggested in his essay on the principle of population that populations grow with time, but their resources grow as well, but there's a difference in the way that these two things grow. So population increase geometrically. That means at some point they could become very fast. And the resources, they increase in a linear fashion, arithmetically. And so that means at some point there will be a point of crisis where the resources start becoming scarcer relative to the population. And then populations suffer from shortages. And that could actually mean various sort of things that people were able to observe in human history. Food shortages, famine, diseases, war. We know this today. There are quite a number of civilizations that just disappeared completely, whether in America, like in South America, or in Mesopotamia, or in Egypt, or whatever, because of the shortage of resources eventually that led to the disappearance of some civilizations. So Darwin was impressed with this idea, very simple idea, but he felt that maybe the same thing could be applied to all populations, not just human populations. He was also influenced by the way that artificial selection was very successful in breeding various sort of breeds from one ancestral animal. For example, we all know that the dog descended from a wolf-like ancestor, but now we have all sorts of breeds that all come from this common ancestor. Now, these are just some of the breeds. If you actually want to see the number of breeds there are countless breeds that are produced just from the same genome, which is the wolf-like genome. And so he was able to see that there are various things that manifest themselves from inheritance, which he didn't know how, but he was able to see that there was some manifestation of this inheritance material, or whatever, the inheritance mechanism, into various ways. Now, he not only dogs, I mean, artificial selection or selective breeding was practiced on pigeons and chicken. Actually, he did some of his experiments on this as well. And so he was able to see that one could produce various sort of differences, which one would call adaptations in a way. to be selected artificially, that people could just select which breed they want. We know, for example, this because a lot of our foods are produced in this way. A lot of the species that we use for our production of our food, for example, the wheat or corn, it's known how they were selected eventually to be the way they are today. But their ancestors are wild relatives that humans were selecting from generation to generation until we get, for example, the modern corn or the bread wheat that we use today. Now, one problem between Darwinism and Lamarckian evolution is the way that Lamarck suggested that evolution is going somewhere. That's a sort of teleology that he inherited from Aristotle, that it's bound to lead in a certain way. So evolution is goal-oriented. Another thing that he suggested that species do not go extinct. They just evolve into different species, which is true partly, that some species, yes, they do change into different species, but some species actually do go extinct. Now, the worst idea that he produced was really that characteristics could be developed by use and disuse. And so any particular characteristic that might prove to be useful to the species concerned, the animal, for example, then this will be inherited by the next generation, and then all the descendants will have it. For example, to take the giraffe as a classical example of how the long neck in the giraffe was produced by evolution, he suggested that if you have giraffes in a certain habitat where it might be beneficial to the giraffe to have a long neck so they can reach the food, so maybe all of them will stretch their neck to reach the food. And so the necks will stretch a tiny amount, not much, because that's what the idea about Lamarckian evolution, that things happen very slowly, in small, very small steps. But all the giraffes eventually will have slightly longer neck, and they will lead to a new generation of their descendants will also have, they will inherit this small change in the neck. And then these in turn, if the idea of stretching of the food being obtained by longer neck still is useful, then also they will lead to a new generation. So all the giraffes actually eventually produce descendants that are different in the generation that comes from the previous generation. Now, natural selection looks at the thing differently, because that was really the simple but brilliant idea that nobody thought of, that in any population, and we know this, everybody was able to observe this, in any population of any sort of creature, any sort of organism, there is variation. Not all the individuals of a particular population or particular kind are the same. Some of them might have a difference there. In the case of the giraffe, maybe some giraffes might have a slightly longer neck. Now, the problem with Darwin was that he didn't know how to explain variation. Now we know that it comes from mutation. Mutation that produces change in the genes that over many millions of years eventually will produce such a huge variation amongst individuals. Now, he couldn't explain variation, and people always looked at this as being a deficiency in Darwinism. But anyway, he talked about variation. He didn't even know how this is inherited. Anyway, inheritance was not really clear for them. But if you look at the generation that comes afterwards, the giraffe that had a slightly longer neck would have slightly more offspring. They would have their own descendants. And these, if they're still successful in this sort of environment, then they will also produce slightly more offspring than the next generation. So over many, many generations, eventually, the ones that do not have this characteristic of having a slightly longer neck will not survive. And the ones that have slightly longer neck will survive better and produce better. And so natural selection means that the process is not applying to all the individuals there. The process is happening to a population as a whole, where some individuals are able to lead to other individuals, their descendants, which carry this characteristic, and so they survive by natural selection. If this characteristic is favorable, then nature will select for, rather against this sort of characteristic. Now, between 1861 and 69, Huxley acted as Darwin's bulldog because Darwin was feeling ill all the time, and so he was the one that was going around and arguing with people, appearing in dialogues and debates, and he was called Darwin's bulldog. But he regretted the fact that he wasn't able to really come up with this idea like Darwin, because it's just a simple idea, and how stupid it was not to have thought of a simple idea like this one. Now, Darwin, at some point, or at this point, he didn't yet talk about human evolution, but Huxley ventured into this, and so he produced a couple of books on this, about man's place in nature, and he compared man with all the apes, the primates as a whole. Now, Huxley is credited with coining two words. One of them is Darwinism, and the other one is agnostic. Now, Darwinism referred to the mechanism of evolution by the way that Darwin proposed it. And the word agnostic, it was less challenging to the established order there, less challenging than the word atheistic. So agnostic meant, I don't know, maybe there's God or maybe there's no God. Atheism says there's no God. But agnostic is sort of milder word to speak. And so a lot of people are today will classify themselves as being agnostic. Now, at that time, anyway, Darwin produced various other books. There were some books on human evolution, but he didn't have much, by the way, on this, and we will see later on how little he knew about human evolution, which is based on the presence of only one other species. But he talked about behavior in particular. Sexual selection, that's how selection favored, for example, different body sizes in males and females, and how emotions are expressed in relation to other animals, including, for example, the most closely related, which are the primates, the apes. Now, there was a deficiency in Darwinian evolution until in the 1900s, somebody discovered the work of the monk Gregor Mendel, which he was doing his experiments in the garden on garden peas, and eventually the development of genetics that appeared within the first few decades of the 20th century was the most important contribution to evolutionary thought. Now, it actually plugged a hole in Darwinism. There was deficiency that Lamarck had, and Darwin didn't know any better. But they both couldn't explain how inheritance could occur and how characteristics could be actually inherited. And so Mendelian genetics was important, and the development of genetics in all sorts of ways, the Mendelian genetic, and later on in the 20th century, molecular genetics and so on, actually were very important contributions to evolutionary thought. So in the 1930s and 40s, various biologists got together and they produced from all these developments in genetics the new synthesis of evolutionary theory, which forms the basis of the evolutionary theory today, with some additions regarding various little details here and there. Now, this is what's sometimes called New Darwinism, and it's enough explanation for the history of life on Earth. Now, the idea of any theory is to explain something. So, what does evolutionary theory explain? First, it explained the fossils, that people had all sorts of explanations that didn't make any sense. So fossils showed a pattern, a temporal pattern over time. And you can actually see the variation of organisms as you go through the fossils. And so the fossils were shown, or they were actually manifesting the change and the fact that there are also extinctions as well. And so the most recent fossils look more similar to present life. The older the fossils are, the more different they are from the modern existing life. Now, in any sort of fossil record, there were gaps. But at the time of Darwin, there were even more gaps. But since Darwin's time, there were a lot of gaps that have been filled. But even today, there are still many gaps that have to be filled, because one has to realize that fossils do not record all the living things that appear and disappear, or they don't all get fossilized. Now, the fossils could sometimes produce a story of how certain organisms evolved. For example, the story of the horse is known to start from a small animal into the big horse that we have today. We have all the fossils there that fill in all the gaps. And so we have a good detailed story of how the horse evolved. Now, the problem about fossils sometimes, about evolution generally, is that if you look at the relationship between organisms that appear in a fossil record, you might not believe that a particular species leads to another one. For example, on one corner, eventually evolved into the other one on the corner down there. Now, if you look at this and the descendant, you might not really feel that it makes sense. But then if you look at all the steps in between, then you will see that there's this gradual change from one form into the other, and eventually it makes sense. And the same applies to all sorts of organisms that sometimes you cannot make sense of them being different, being related when they're so different. Now, the other idea that evolution explained is that why in a certain area the organisms have to be more similar than ones in distant areas. So the geographical, with biogeography, the geographical distribution of organisms illustrate very clearly that the more closely existent the species are, the more closely related, and that means they're actually the more similar, and that means they're closely related. Take, for example, the fish in South America. If you look at various rivers in South America, then you look at the distribution of fish or look at the distribution of butterflies, the ones that tend to be most closely or similar are the ones that are geographically more proximate. They're ones that are close to each other. It's like in humans, usually. And if you live in a village, then the more related individuals are usually the ones that live nearby. So your brothers, your cousins, and so on and so on. And then in the next village, there'll be probably some distant cousins and so on. So species are like this. In comparative anatomy, we can see similarities in structure between various organisms that there's no other way of explaining. So here, the ones of the same color tend to be similar, or homologous structures, as we refer to them. And you can see that the difference between one and the other sometimes could just be in some location, or the size and the number of the thing are the same, more or less. And so we have different animals that sometimes you might not think of them as being related, but the anatomy there shows the similarity. Now, these similarities sometimes show over time, and so sometimes you're left with some vestigial structures that you've inherited from previous generation. For example, the whale, we know the whale today as being a mammal that eventually evolved to become a marine mammal. And it lost the need for legs, but there are bones for the legs that still remain there. If you look at snakes that have no legs, some snakes still have the remnants of those legs that disappeared over time when they're not needed as much. Take, for example, this lizard, which is not a snake, but this lizard is a lizard that still has some vestigial structure there, which is these small, tiny legs, because it lost the need for them over many generations, because it's the burrowing, like snakes are burrowing, they burrow into the soil. Now, we have plenty of vestigial organs that sometimes there's no other way of explaining. For example, the ear muscles, which are used in our ancestors to move the ears around. We have the third molar, which is something that was found in our ancestors, the ape-like ancestors. And nowadays, because our jaw has been reduced, the only thing that this produces for us is just problems, because it's growing in the space that was not as big as, or not as spacious as before. The body hair, for example, we still have body hair in many parts of our body that are not useful anymore, but they still behave in the same way. Like, for example, when animals get cold, their hair erects. Now, we still have our hair erecting, even though that's not making a difference for our insulation, because the erection of the hair is actually a way of increasing the insulation for the body. We have the appendix, with the only thing that it does is that give us trouble, and then we have to operate to get rid of it. Take, for example, which is not found in all humans, the Darwin's tubercle, or Darwin's point, which you can find in your ear. And, well, if you don't have it, this doesn't refute evolution. You might still have your animal ancestry. Now, you can see the origin of that point. It just remains in some ears. There's some genetic difference between humans, that some humans produce, some do not. Look at the embryos, how similar they are. When they're young, the earlier you look at an embryo, the more similar they become. So here, the snake, chicken, opossum, human, bat, cat, all of them, if you actually go look in earlier stages, then you will find that they're almost indistinguishable. And then they start differentiating, then they become the different sorts of organisms. We have common amongst all organisms some of the biochemical processes. So in all organisms, we have nucleotides, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, DNA, and RNA. Genetic material is the same. In genetic engineering, you can actually have one segment of DNA inserted into the genome of another organism, and then that segment of DNA will start working as if it's in its original location. And so it shows that the basic mechanism by which all these processes happen is the same. And that actually constitutes the evidence for the common origin. Now, adaptations, we have various adaptations that all seem to be related to the habitat, to the environment. And we see this in all sorts of animals. In mammals, we see it in birds. Each one of these beaks is adapted for a particular function, which will evolve over time. And then one of the criticisms about evolutionary theory is that people thought that, well, we cannot see evolution happening. Actually, we do. What people say sometimes that we cannot see new species happening. But that takes a long time. But evolutionary processes are happening all the time. One example is the antibiotic resistance in humans, for example. We know this, that over time, more bacteria become more and more resistant. It's not because the bacteria become resistant, because natural selection, which is the antibiotic, encourages the ones that have slight resistance to the antibiotic. They produce a new generation of bacteria that are resistant. And so the more that this factor, which is antibiotic, is applied in any situation, then there are more and more selection happening to produce selected bacteria that tend to be antibiotic resistant. The same applies in insects. They become resistant to insecticides. And many species nowadays, during the 20th century, have been observed to have become more tolerant to pollutants when they become subjected to this, because there's a new generation of plants that are appearing that tend to be more pollutant. Now, the main problem that some people point out is that how could you have a design, such a nice, beautiful design like us humans, and not have a designer? How can you have any organism that's so perfectly adapted without a designer? Now, the concept of design without a designer was emphasized in Ayala's paper in 2007, which showed that any system might actually eventually produce certain patterns that will be governed basically by physical, natural laws. And design, like the eye, how could the eye evolve? One could actually see the various stages of the eye, from a sort of tissue that is sensitive to light into eventually a light receiving organ like the eye with a lens and all sorts of complications there. Now, one could see the fact that languages, for example, come without a designer. Nobody could claim that the language was designed by anyone or anywhere. But you can see not only that they evolve without anyone managing or designing them in any way, but the other thing that you can see is the way that you can actually classify languages in a similar way that you can classify species. Now, there are quite a lot of classifications there that actually use some techniques that could be sometimes similar to the techniques used to classify species. And there are also the same idea there of the biogeography, that the languages that are similar happen to be in close proximity, and the ones that are different happen to be in a different area. Now, hostility to Darwin obviously would be expected, but most of the time people might have accepted the idea that, well, the beetle descends from a worm or something like this, but humans descending from something like an ape, that was actually not really something that people will swallow. And so they always excluded humans. And so Darwin's work implied evolution of humans, despite the fact that he didn't know much about human evolution at that time, because at that time there were only one other human species other than Homo sapiens, and that's the Homo neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthal man. The Neanderthal man was the only known fossil that was different from the modern human. But he actually suggested that maybe light, that's one of the Darwin statements, will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That was in 1880, and which is quite bold, really, with so little known about human evolution. Nowadays, we have thousands of species that we have discovered all over the world, from Africa to Asia and everywhere. And we have thousands of fossils, and the story keeps building up. There's changes that happen. The earliest one is probably something like more than 6 million years ago. But one thing we have to realize, because sometimes people say, well, how could the human, such a perfect human, evolve within even 6 million? Well, actually, any organism has taken, like humans, we have taken 3.7 billion years to evolve. We're just one sort of species that evolved as different from other species that came before us. But the process of evolution that led to humans is a process that started 3.7 billion years ago. Now, the latest discovery is the Homo naledi, which also, each time there's a discovery, it changes our view of human evolution. It sort of builds the picture in a different way. Recently, there were some Chinese fossils discovered. That's in last year. And so, also, they point out to some pattern of evolution of humans that's different from what's been accepted earlier. So all the time there is this build-up of the picture about evolution. Behavior evolved as well. We see this in some insects, for example. Now, the family tree there of the phylogeny of the bees is based on their similarity in DNA. But one could see that the similarity in DNA is actually reflected also in their evolutionary and their behavioral patterns. So behavioral patterns follow these evolutionary paths as well. Now, take humans, for example. There are plenty of things that we can normally think of in human behavior that could only be understood in evolution terms. Just a simple example like a smile, or body language, really, because before the word, like I said, the first thing was the word, but it wasn't actually. Before the word, there was body language. Humans, like many animals, communicated by various sort of limited vocabulary. The smile is one of them. And if you look at a chimpanzee smiling, the chimpanzee is trying to tell other chimpanzees that I don't mean any harm, I'm friendly. And so you can see this happening in various other monkeys, if you want to see all sorts of smiling monkeys. This one, for example, is from Darwin's book, which showed a baboon smiling, so to speak. When somebody scratches its back, it's an expression of pleasure or happiness. And so that's what a smile is. But other aspects of human behavior could only be understood and could be explained and could be compared with other animals. For example, in a way that we make our mate choices. They're quite clear mechanisms where how we select our mate, whether male or female. Social behavior. You could explain social behavior in the same way that you can explain social behavior in a variety of organisms, including for sometimes simple sort of organisms. Now, there are some unique aspects in human behavior, for example, that suggested that some thousands of years ago, Homo sapiens had this characteristic that made the species spread all over the world, which is not the sort of thing that many animals are capable of doing. Not many human species before were capable of doing. So Homo sapiens dispersed so widely within a short period of time, and there was some genetic basis for this. Now, the problem with evolution and Darwinism at that time was that evolution would really degrade human ethics, because then we will start looking at ourselves as being just another animal. Or it might say something like, okay, survival of the fittest, then that means I'm the fittest and I would survive whatever. And that meant that there'd be great danger to social order from these ideas. Now, somebody who came up with these silly ideas, there's social Darwinism that was promoted by Spencer, where he actually made some, the field of eugenics, selecting, accelerating the process of evolution by selecting the most intelligent or the most perfect, and maybe doing away or sacrificing the ones that who have handicaps or whatever. And so, this is not really Darwinism, and it was a misconception and misapplication of of Darwinistic ideas. Now, it actually implies selfishness, which is not the case, because really, if you look at the various ways by which we treat each other, because sometimes this might be looked at as being based on religion or on some philosophies and the way that you should behave in this way because God wants this and so on. Actually, social order or social relationship or social groups in humans could be similar to social groups in a variety of other species. For example, like the chimpanzees, like the lions. You can see this even in lower animals, so to speak, like ants and bees. They have a social order there, which has come from biological evolution. Now, the fact that we are a social group and we tend to be nice to each other is not because there was some religious or philosophical reason for this. It's because biologically it will work better. We will do better as a social group. Humans have been successful because they were able to establish groups. So their biological success is based on or is due to their social behavior. Well, you get the opposite sometimes, no doubt. Now, what's the impact of evolutionary theory? Now, some people suggest that there's no way that you can explain things in biology except in the light of evolution, like what Dobzhansky suggested. In many ways, this might actually be true. Like, evolution would explain a lot of things that could not be explained otherwise. Now, the field of evolutionary biology actually appeared after Darwin, and so there was the population thinking that emerged that made a difference. Now, there was a modern Darwinian zeitgeist, which is really suggesting that there's no biologist who would influence human thought in the way that Darwin and Darwinism and ultimately evolution influenced the human thought and intellect. And there are a number of things that actually also were refuted, like we've seen in the case of Lamarck, teleology or determinism, that evolution is bound to lead anywhere. In particular, any particular evolution process will lead in a specified end, where this is what's called teleology, the final cause to which evolution is proceeding. This was actually refuted as well, because evolution could go anywhere. Any species could evolve in any different way, sometimes based on environment, sometimes based on randomness, by chance. And typology, which normally looks at organisms as types, unchanging types, and there's no variation like in the Platonic ideas, then also that was refuted. Now, then we have a new view of humanity that really singled out humans as being different from other species, something that evolution doesn't really make us as just one other animal. It points out that humans have become unique because they have various characteristics that make them unique. And the rejection of supernatural phenomena, rejection of supernatural causes for creation, for biological, it was a big challenge to Christian philosophy, and obviously that will really produce conflicts with various sort of religions and faiths. And there's this uneasy relationship with religion, and you can see various people, like in the States in the 80s, there was a big aggressive move by fundamentalists to really destroy the idea of evolution. And so these ideas like creationist science and intelligent design and so on, and they made evolution appear to be the root of all evil that they will think of as being evil. Now, we have here some conflict that appeared in 1882. This was about the time when Darwin died, and Edwin Lewis at that time was asked to deliver the commencement speech, and so he actually mentioned Darwin as being an example of transformation of knowledge into science by long and careful examination and accurate thinking. Now, George Post was offended by this. Remember, the university was a missionary, clearly at that time. Now, some people sided with Edwin Lewis, like Cornelius van Dyck, and there was a lot of turmoil. Some faculty members resigned, students went on protests, and some students were suspended, and so on. And the university, obviously, since that time, we've come a long way. I've been teaching evolution for the last 25 years, and I don't see anybody protesting at this. But anyway, one has to realize that religion and science do not always conflict. We know that there's various religious establishments that accept evolution. They try to sort of reconcile with these scientific ideas. And some recent papers suggested that maybe there are some extremists on both sides that are making the problem worse, but it's not necessarily that they will really, there are real conflicts as much as people will think. Anyway, evolutionary theory has been attacked for a long time, but they're not seriously challenged. This remains the only explanation, the best explanation. If anybody has any other explanation, then let us know. Now, just to remind you what Robert Darwin told his son, "You will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." That was his letter. And when Darwin died in 1882, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, along with England's great men and women. And then probably everybody was happy ever after that, but nobody asked the monkeys their opinion, because I don't think the monkeys would like to be told that they have evolved into humans. Thank you very much.